On July 31, 2025, after spending 29 years on death row, Edward J. Zakruski was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. But before we talk about his final moments, his last meal, and his chilling last words, we need to understand what got him there in the first place. It all started on June 9, 1994, in a quiet Mary neighborhood in Florida. Edward Zakruski was 29 years old, a technical sergeant in the United States Air Force, married to Sylvia, and raising 2 young children. Outwardly, he looked like the image of a stable, disciplined man. But at home, things were falling apart. Edward and Sylvia's marriage had been strained for months. Tension was growing, and those close to them had already seen the warning signs. Edward had made threats before. More than once, he told a neighbor that if Sylvia ever tried to leave him, he would kill them all before letting her take the kids. And that June morning, everything boiled over. Edward was at work on base when he received a phone call from home. His 7-year-old son, Edward III, whom they affectionately called Kim, was on the line. He told his father that Sylvia was planning to leave him and take the children with her back to South Korea. Edward didn't get angry. He didn't yell. Instead, he left the base quietly during his lunch break, went to a hardware store, and purchased a machete. Then he returned to work like nothing had happened, clocked back in, and finished his shift. But something inside him had changed. That evening, Edward arrived home before Sylvia and the children. Inside the house, he placed the machete in the bathroom and laid out a crowbar and rope, all within reach. Then he waited. When 34-year-old Sylvia walked through the front door, she had no idea what was coming. She sat down in the living room, tired, at ease, but Edward was already behind her. He raised the crowbar and struck her in the head. Then again. The blows knocked her unconscious, but she was still breathing. He dragged her limp body to the bedroom, wrapped a rope around her neck, and strangled her until she stopped moving. After killing Sylvia, Edward walked into the bathroom and called for his son. "Come brush your teeth," he said. 7-year-old Kim came in as if it were a normal night. But the moment he stepped inside, Edward attacked. Kim tried to block the blade with his arm, leaving a deep gash in his wrist, but Edward didn't stop. He swung the machete again and again. The final blows landed across Kim's head, neck, and back. The boy collapsed near the sink and died on the bathroom floor. Then Edward called for his daughter. 5-year-old Anna still trusted her father completely. When he said, "Come brush your teeth," she walked in without hesitation. But just like her brother, she was met with a machete. She tried to defend herself. Defensive wounds were later found on her hand and elbow. But there was no escape. Edward brought the blade down repeatedly until she collapsed beside her brother. Afterward, Edward returned to the bedroom and dragged Sylvia's lifeless body into the bathroom next to her 2 children. He wasn't sure she was dead, so he picked up the machete and struck her one final time. When it was over, Edward didn't panic. He didn't call for help. He didn't stay. He walked out of the house, got into his car, drove to Orlando, and caught a flight to Hawaii. There, he changed his name to Michael Green and joined a secluded religious commune. There he lived in a makeshift shack, worked in exchange for food and shelter, and blended into the quiet hills like he had always been there. But back in Florida, his absence didn't go unnoticed. When Edward failed to show up for work at the Air Force Base, his name was marked as AWOL, absent without leave. Local deputies were sent to conduct a welfare check. What they found was horrifying. Inside the Zakruski home, 3 bodies lay in a pool of blood. Sylvia, Kim, and Anna, all brutally murdered. Edward was gone. A manhunt began. For 4 months, Edward remained a ghost. No leads, no sightings. But everything changed on October 15, 1994, when Unsolved Mysteries aired an episode on the case. The moment Edward's photo appeared on screen, the people he'd been living with on the Hawaiian commune recognized him. One of them turned to him and said, "Brother Michael, that looks a lot like you." Edward didn't respond. He returned to his shack and left a handwritten note, "I'm sorry." 9 days later, on October 24th, Edward Zakruski walked into a police station and turned himself in. But why would a decorated airman, a father, and a husband do something so brutal? Edward was originally from Kalamazoo, Michigan. He had climbed the military ranks to technical sergeant in the U.S. Air Force. In 1986, while stationed in Montana, he met a young South Korean woman named Impin. She became pregnant, they married, and she adopted the name Sylvia. On the surface, they looked like the picture of a stable, multicultural military family. But behind closed doors, the story was different. In 1989, Edward was stationed in South Korea, and the family moved with him. But life overseas wasn't easy. Not for Sylvia. As a South Korean woman married to an American, raising mixed-race children, she faced harsh judgment and open discrimination in her own country. Tensions grew at home, and the marriage started to show cracks. When the tour was over in 1992, they returned to Okaloosa County, Florida. But a new zip code couldn't fix what had already been falling apart. And by the summer of 1994, Sylvia had made her decision. The marriage wasn't working. She wanted out, and she wanted to take the kids back with her to South Korea. That decision didn't come lightly, but she had been thinking about it for a while. But what she didn't know was that Edward had also been thinking about the future, but in a very different way, as his plan ended in murder. Edward was extradited to Florida, where he faced 3 counts of first-degree murder. But even behind bars, he wasn't done trying to run. Less than a year later, in August 1995, Edward and another inmate tried to break out of Okaloosa County Jail. They made it as far as the outer fence before guards caught them, shutting down the escape before it got off the ground. Eventually, he gave up running. On March 19, 1996, he walked into a Florida courtroom and confessed to all 3 counts. And from that point on, the trial was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about punishment, about whether he should live or die. During sentencing, the prosecution didn't hold back. They described the murders as heinous and cruel. They said Edward didn't just kill, he did so with cold calculation. The courtroom heard how Anna, the youngest, had likely seen her brother's blood on the floor before she died. The prosecutors called it unimaginable. They said no child should die that way, and no father should inflict that kind of horror on his children. The defense offered a different picture. They said Edward had been mentally unraveling. He was pushed past his breaking point by threats, emotional strain, and fear of losing his children. They said the murders weren't acts of rage, but twisted acts of mercy. The jury gave split decisions. 7 voted for death for Sylvia. 7 voted for death for Kim. But when it came to Anna, the vote was 6-6. The split vote was enough to spare Edward a death sentence for Anna, or so they thought. But the judge overruled them. On April 19, 1996, the judge sentenced Edward Zakruski to death on all 3 counts. And with that, Edward was sent to Florida's death row. For the next 29 years, Edward Zakruski sat in a cell on Florida's death row. And while the legal clock kept ticking, his fate stayed the same. Then, on July 31st, his final day began before sunrise. Edward woke up around 5 a.m. and quietly prepared for what was coming. He was allowed one final visit, but he declined the offer to meet with a spiritual advisor. For his last meal, he ordered fried pork chops, potatoes, bacon, fried onions, toast, root beer, a slice of pie, a scoop of ice cream, and a cup of coffee to wash it all down. Later that day, Edward was led into the execution chamber and strapped to the gurney. There were 14 witnesses present, plus media reporters and prison staff. When the warden asked if he had any last words, Edward didn't hesitate. "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold and calculated, clean, humane, and efficient way possible," he said. "I have no complaints whatsoever." Then, in a calm voice, he began quoting Robert Frost's famous poem, "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening." He didn't finish the poem as his voice trailed off partway through. At 6:04 p.m., the drugs began to flow. Edward gasped a few times, his chest rising and falling in sharp jolts, but within moments, his breathing slowed. By 6:12 p.m., he was still. Officials pronounced him dead just 1 minute later at 6:13 p.m. Edward Zakruski was 60 years old. He left behind a trail of devastation. A wife. 2 children. Gone. A father. A husband. A soldier. A killer. Edward Zakruski's case reminds us of how darkness can hide behind the most disciplined facades. He wasn't a stranger. He was family. And his victims were the people who trusted him the most. And the question that still lingers, was this justice served, or a punishment decades too late? If you found this story powerful, please subscribe, like, and share. Comment below. What are your thoughts on split jury death sentences? Was Edward's execution justified? Thank you for watching.